Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for episode 101 of the podcast. Today, you'll hear a deep and interesting conversation that I had with my friend Erica Webb. This is less of an interview and more of a casual conversation about our shared experience of being HSPs. HSP stands for highly sensitive person, and I've known for a while that I fit into this category. Perhaps you identify that way as well. In the past year or so, I've started to look into it a little more closely, and it's been really helpful to consider high sensitivity as another lens for understanding myself and for giving myself tools to better navigate life. So when I saw a few months ago that Erica was really starting to talk about HSP a lot on her podcast and in her social media, I was really excited. So I reached out to her and asked if she'd like to do a joint episode that we would each share on our podcasts, and this conversation is the result. You'll hear about our stories of living life as a highly sensitive person, embracing our HSP traits, and honoring our HSP needs. We talked about a lot in this conversation, which is why it's about 90 minutes, because HSPs like to go deep, you know? So we cover some basics and quite a few nuances of what high sensitivity is, like how it relates to being introverted or an empath, and more. We also talk about how honoring our sensitivity doesn't mean making life small or living in a bubble, and what movement, meditation, and life strategies help us engage with the world, but to do that more on our own terms. Erica has been a guest on my podcast before, way back in episode 14, when we talked about somatics and self-kindness. She is a mindful movement coach who uses somatic exercise, yoga, and mat Pilates to support people to shift tension and reconnect with their body through a lens of self-kindness and curiosity. Erica's approach to movement is one that centers simplicity and gently moving beyond our subconscious habits. Based in Melbourne, Australia, Erica is also a registered counselor with a background in behavioral science, and she's known for emphasizing kindness and compassion in all facets of movement practice, from how we motivate ourselves through self-talk and how we make choices on the mat and beyond. Erica is also one of the brilliant guest speakers in my Mindful Movement Teacher Training, which will be starting in October. In case you haven't checked this out yet, the Mindful Movement Teacher Training, or MMTT, is an interdisciplinary program that draws from Buddhism, yoga, Qigong, and somatics, exploring movement as an accessible form of meditation. The training emphasizes versatile, adaptable, practical movements that you can share in a variety of different settings to help people regulate their nervous systems, ease aches and pains, and find more meaning through embodied contemplative experiences. There is an early registration discount for MMTT until the end of this month, so if this sounds interesting to you, now is the ideal time to apply at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT. And also be sure to check out the show notes for this episode on the podcast page of my website for links to Erica's work, especially if you are looking for some really great HSP-friendly resources and practices. All right, this is a big conversation, so we'd better get to it. I hope you'll enjoy this talk and maybe find some validation or insight in what we share. Thanks again for listening. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Addie D. Hilster, and I am here with my friend Erica Webb. And today we're going to be talking about HSPs, or highly sensitive persons. And this is going to be a shared episode published on both of our podcasts. So, kind of more of a free flowing conversation between us. And I am anticipating a really rich conversation since it's a topic we're both really, really interested in. So, Erica, do you want to just start us off by talking about what HSP means or what it is for those who may not be so familiar? Because I know that you've been doing a lot of work around this.
Yeah, sure. So, what I often find with HSP, and when you sort of start talking about highly sensitive people, usually if you are one, just that word will be enough to go, oh, I think that might be me. Because
Mm-hmm.
you've probably been called sensitive, you've probably been called too sensitive. And so it's something usually that I think we self-identify as when we hear the word, but not always, because it can come with some negative connotations as well. And so I know I've had clients that are like, oh, I don't really like the way that sounds. And so they haven't resonated with it immediately. But essentially, high sensitivity is a sensitivity to stimulation. And so highly sensitive people process things on a deeper level. We are, for every bit of information, we're processing it just more deeply, I guess, than people who are not highly sensitive. And that's not to say other people aren't sensitive, they absolutely are, but highly sensitive people are, it's like a web, right? Like if you think of a spider's web, we're kind of pulling all the pieces of information together. There's a depth of processing that is just much more, I don't want to use the word significant, but much deeper than it might otherwise be. And I think some of the characteristics that tend to be fairly universal for highly sensitive people is being overwhelmed quite easily, particularly emotionally overwhelmed quite easily. Some highly sensitive people are really affected by like bright lights, loud sounds, just too many things to do and too many things to process at once. Not everyone is as affected by that. And I think in our modern day world, we're a little bit desensitized to that sometimes, some people. And it can also be like things like picking up on other people's emotions. We often are the people pleasers too, because we can do that very effectively. And so, yeah, but at the heart of it, it's the depth of processing, and they found that across species, which is super interesting. I find that really fascinating. So it's not a human specific trait. And it is a trait. I guess that's the other thing to point out. We tend to be born that way. And so, often a highly sensitive person, if they asked a parent what they were like as a child, they were probably the one that cried quite easily, possibly quite shy. Don't always, highly sensitive people aren't always introverts, but most of them are. So yeah, I don't know, does that give a good
That's
sort of
great.
nutshell?
Yeah, that's a great foundation. And it is like a difference in how we're wired in our brain,
Mm-hmm.
right? How our nervous system responds to things. So it isn't just a perception, it is a real inborn difference.
Yeah, I like to think of it sometimes the way that I like to think about it, and I don't know if this is scientifically accurate, but I think it makes a lot of sense. The window of tolerance work, where there's this
Yeah.
sort of idea that we have an optimal range of arousal that we can most effectively work in. I think of highly sensitive people as having kind of like a smaller window. Um, but I don't know if it's exactly that we have a smaller window or that we are just the amount of information coming in and being processed is so much greater that it's easier to exceed our window of tolerance. And so I kind of like to think of it almost on a nervous system level, which,
Hmm.
yeah, I hope that there's lots of more research happening in that area actually, like, because I'm sure that they're going to find a lot of really interesting, juicy things.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting way of looking at it. And also that you mentioned being introverted, because I think there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of HSPs are probably also introverts, but not necessarily. And it's not necessarily the same thing. And I think of HSP as having more to do with the senses and how I perceive and interact with the world, and how my what my brain and my nervous system does with those stimuli, and with emotions and with feelings, and internal stimuli as well as external. And
Mm.
introversion is more about, what drains you and what recharges you. Like being with people, does that give you energy and fill you up, or does that tend to make you tired as much as you may love the people, And, for an introvert, we need to kind of like recharge and have, alone time, but that's about kind of our social perceptions and interactions and tendencies, as opposed to HSP, which I think is even more fundamental in a way. It's more about
Yeah.
like how our system processes everything that's coming through it internally and externally.
Mm. And maybe even it's akin to like a volume knob, it's like, I think being highly sensitive, it's just like when you've got a podcast mic, you can turn the gain right up so
Hmm.
that it's like picking up more stuff. I think it's sort of like that, the gain is turned all the way up for a HSP. You actually can't, you can desensitize yourself as a HSP, but you can't stop the process of deep processing.
Mm.
It's automatic. And so I think that's why, it can be quite tiring sometimes as a HSP, and we can get quite overwhelmed, because it's not like you can say, well, I'm just going to not process all of that information. That depth of processing happens subconsciously. So you're not in control of that necessarily.
I think sometimes it's too is like a time factor, because it's like I'm processing things deeply and therefore it takes me a little longer because more different details are maybe being pulled in through my brain and my associations and my my memories, or whatever resonance it seems to have, and it seems like it takes me a while, and I need space sometimes to let that happen before the next thing comes around. And
Yeah.
that's when the overwhelm kind of starts to pile up if things are coming at me just like a little bit too fast or too much too fast.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And there is a subset of highly sensitive people who are like adrenaline seekers,
And
sensation
that's so
seekers.
interesting. I don't
Mm.
understand that yet. I don't. Do you know more about that?
Well, I mean, I know a little bit, and I find it fascinating that there's a subset of HSPs who are extroverts, because I also
Hmm.
don't understand that. Although I know I can be extroverted in certain circumstances, but yeah, there is a subset that are high sensation seeking. And so you can be highly sensitive and be really into like extreme sports, jumping out of airplanes, doing all that sort of stuff, which I find fascinating, because I'm like, for the average HSP, that would like blow the roof off. Like that would be way
Hmm.
too much. It would be so overstimulating. I don't know enough about it to talk with any authority on it, but it does exist. So I think it's worth pointing out, because I think like high sensitivity is a trait that then interacts with a whole bunch of other traits that you possess. And so it's
Hmm.
not the whole of who a person is, although it can feel very much like a really huge part. I know for me, it's a huge part of who I am and how I feel in the world. But it does interact with other parts of you. And so we're not all the same, although I think we find each other. Like, I often think it can feel like, are you sure not everybody thinks and feels this way? Because we often have built our worlds with other highly sensitive people in close proximity.
Hmm.
And so it can feel a little bit like we create our own little HSP world sometimes, I think. Um,
That's yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, I hope she wouldn't get mad at me for saying this, but I think my sister might be that like sensation seeking HSP. Because you
ah,
wouldn't know, you might not know, like, until you get to know her, that she's actually quite a sensitive soul, because that's not what she presents consciously. And I think that's a choice in some ways. But she loves roller coasters. She loves spooky things like haunted houses, horror movies. I can't deal with any of that, which she thinks is hilarious. But I'm the
yes.
like timid older sister who's scared of horror movies. And she was like, bring it on. But she loves that kind of thrill seeking stuff, and I've always found that so interesting because there is like a deeper side of her that is quite sensitized and sensitive, and she's like this animal lover, and like she just
Yeah.
has the biggest heart for animals and yeah, and other things. But
I don't know. I still don't get it, but
Yeah, and it's funny, when I was younger, I was much more of a thrill seeker. Like I loved roller coasters, and other things like that. And I think you know what, I think in some other existence, I probably could be that thrill-seeking HSP even as an adult. But what I've found is that for me, anxiety has gotten in the way of that a little bit, and so it can be tricky, I think, to sometimes pull those pieces apart too. Is sometimes, I don't know if there's data on this, but highly sensitive people, I work with a lot of highly sensitive people, and anxiety is very common.
Mhm.
And so I do wonder if sometimes our anxiety maybe would cover over some of those other natural tendencies towards those things. I don't know. It's interesting, but it's not the seeking of thrills or the lack of seeking of thrills that defines a highly sensitive person. But probably, I reckon, if we put a room full of highly sensitive people, you'd have more that would sit out of those activities than who would opt in.
Than
Yeah.
not, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how we came across this term or figured out and identified with this trait of being an HSP. How did you find out that you might be this
I'm
HSP person?
I don't remember. I actually don't remember. I was thinking about this before we jumped on, and I'm like, I actually don't remember. I have had the Elaine Aron Highly Sensitive Person book on my shelf for, it has to be at least 15 years. I don't know when it was published, but it
I
was
feel
before
like
that.
96 or something, like mid
Yeah.
90s.
I definitely was an adult when when I got the language for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But I resisted it for a really long time because I didn't particularly like that part of myself,
Hmm.
because it was the part of me that often got um, ridiculed, I guess, and shamed. And so I resisted that for a really long time, but I don't remember how I came across it. But I just know that I've known that for a really long time. So you might have a better story. My story's boring because I can't remember it.
I don't think I have a great story either, because it does feel like one of those things that I came across the term a long time ago and was kind of like, yeah, that's probably me, but I didn't look that deeply into it. And
Yeah.
and then I got more interested in it recently, like within the last year. And interestingly, in part because I have been interviewing more people on the podcast about different forms of neurodivergence and just learning more about the diversity of the ways that minds are wired, and um, learning about that in service of being a better teacher, and someone who can offer movement and meditation practices in an accessible way, not just for physical accessibility, but for this other layer of us that's really important. And it was interesting because talking to different people who had other forms of neurodivergence and HSP, some people consider it neurodivergent, some people don't, and it's neither here nor there. But uh, but it was interesting because I would pick up on, like, oh yeah, I can kind of relate to that trait or this trait, but not the whole gamut of what they were describing. So there were sort of overlaps and differences, and then I was like, wait a minute, let me look back at that HSP thing, and then like going through the checklists, or like if I take one of those quizzes, I get like top scores, you know. I get an
Same.
A+ on that test.
Me too.
And it just fits and it just makes sense. Like, even down to the point Elaine Aron says, like, maybe very sensitive to sugar. And I'm like, that's me, man. It's like, it's so clear. So yeah, I think even just that process, like the podcast has brought it kind of more into my awareness recently. And like you said, I think it can be almost like covert or invisible to people who are especially in our field, because I think we might really skew towards the sensitive souls in the kind of work that we do, because we do really quiet and gentle and mindful types of movement practices. So I think there's a high concentration of people who identify in some way or knowingly or unknowingly have the traits of being HSP.
Yeah. And one of the traits of being a HSP is this like depth of thought around like the meaning of life and wanting to understand ourselves, wanting to understand the world, and the desire for deep conversation. And I think that might be how we find each other a lot of the time, because
Yeah.
I'm always shocked that not everybody wants to do that. I'm like, should we, we don't tend to sit at surface level conversation. We dive right in, we dive pretty fast, and we want to understand things. And so if you aren't getting that, you will seek it out, I think, as a highly sensitive person. And so I do think that might be part of the reason why we find people, and why then people listen to our podcasts, and why people come to our classes, because it's something that we crave on a very deep level.
Totally. When I thought about, like, when I was sort of thinking through, like, how does HSP show up in my life, one of the things I thought about was when I started meditating, years ago, and found like this meditation group that I really liked. And it felt like I felt so at home there. And it was like, well, of course, you're going to a place where everyone is going to sit in total silence together and be quiet. And then after doing that, talk about the meaning of life, pretty much. And I was like, that's HSP heaven.
Yep.
So I was like, no wonder I was really drawn to that. It was like that combination of decreasing some of the stimulation and learning skills and techniques and tools around that, and then also making meaning of things and exploring big questions.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful example. I mean, we're not few in number, I mean, we are a minority. I believe the statistic is somewhere between 20 to 30% of people would be highly sensitive. So that's still a lot of people when you think about it. But I think that we end up in much more concentrated groups. You're right. Like if you're going to the meditation class and you've opted in, right? Sometimes non-highly sensitive people are obviously going to show up in that room, but and we're all friends with not highly sensitive people. I sometimes think the language is unfortunate, actually, because I know so many beautiful, sensitive souls who are not highly sensitive people, who you would still describe as sensitive because of the way that they see the world and look at the world, but they don't have that sensory depth, I guess. What the other word that sometimes is used in the literature is sensory processing sensitivity, which I
Yeah.
think is helpful sometimes to like distinguish that, because it's like you can be a really kind, compassionate, sensitive soul, but without the sensory processing sensitivity, it's different. So anyway, that was a little side note.
No, I think that's really helpful because it could sound like we're calling others insensitive or
Exactly. Yeah.
something, or saying that they are living on the surface of life, or, it could be kind of insulting. And that's not what we're after. I think, like, for you and me, it's, at least I can speak for myself. It's like, just, I want to own these traits that have been maybe pushed to the side at times because it's not what our dominant culture supports. But I want to own it for myself so I can work with it and understand it and honor it,
100%. And I think that's the thing for me. Like, I have shifted in the last few months to very much only speaking about HSP stuff. And my reasoning for that is because I know, for me, for a really long time, I couldn't own my sensitivity as a good thing, because it felt very much like the very thing that made me like imperfect, fragile.
kind of extra.
Yeah, exactly. It was
Yeah.
like
High maintenance.
high maintenance, all the things. And so for me, it's like, yeah, how do we, I can't remember the exact word you used there, but, this sense of, yeah, like actually, how do we honor our sensitivity and say, well, this is actually, when honored and when loved, a superpower.
Mhm.
So I reckon that would be an interesting thing to talk about. Like, how has like understanding your sensitivity made it more possible to do that. Because I think if we're looking at it on a surface level and we're kind of just like, oh, I'm just so sensitive, I'm just too, fragile and, whatever, it can be very easy to make it the thing about us that is too difficult. But how do you think understanding your sensitivity has actually allowed you to honor it, embrace it, love it, and just like live life aligned with it more?
Yeah. A couple things come to mind. And one is just being more able to understand what boundaries I need and to advocate for them. Like I was saying, the blood sugar thing is major for me. And like if I don't eat the right quantity and content of food at the right timing, I will get sick. Like I can't skip a snack, man. It's just it's for real. And like sometimes I'll go and spend time with others, or like some of my family members can go like all day and like skip lunch or whatever and put other things first. And if I do that, I'll just get a migraine. I'll just crash and feel like crap possibly for days. And so
Mm-hmm.
I have to insist, like, we're stopping now because I need to eat and it needs to be a certain kind of thing. And sometimes it's a little inconvenient. And sometimes I have to really kind of stick up for it, as basic as that sounds, like feeding yourself. But,
It's huge.
but
That's
it's
actually a
huge.
huge one.
I think it's a temptation for a lot of people who can get away with it to just like skip over that basic form of self care, eating at
Mm.
regular times. But that is not negotiable for me.
Yeah, and I want to say about the food thing. It's so interesting because that's really common for HSPs to like need to eat regularly and to be like get that real hangry kind of
Mhm.
thing if we don't eat. And I think it's probably multifactorial. Like it's probably the blood sugar thing, and it's also like the sensations of being hungry
Mm.
are so distracting. And so you then end up with this another thing to process, which is
Oh, I
the
never
feeling
thought
of
of that.
hunger. Yeah, it's those internal proprioceptive, um, we're picking up on those internal proprioceptive stuff. And so if you're hungry, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you're too cold, if you're too hot, those sorts of things for HSPs can derail us
We can't ignore
because
it.
we can't ignore it. It's not like just like put up and shut up. It's like I can't
I
focus
can't
on
function right now.
anything. Exactly. And so I always like to think about that. I'm the same. If I don't eat, it's all over Red Rover. And my family knows that, so they'll make sure I'm fed. But it can feel so inconvenient, can't it, to just be like, well, I know this isn't a good time, but I'm going to need a snack. It can make
But
you feel like a bit of a
yeah,
child.
it does. It can, I mean, people can kind of roll their eyes at me, but I want to reframe it and look at it like, can we advocate for everyone just having a little more space to take care of themselves in basic ways and, mind that for themselves and to not have it be a problem? Like I know so many people who work at like office jobs, and it's gotten to this point now where people just work through lunch. If they eat at their desk while they're answering emails and there's no break. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is not a healthy trend for society. Just one example, right?
Yeah.
But it's like there's so many ways that we're encouraged not to take care of ourselves. So maybe we can play a role in really advocating for that
Yes.
for everyone.
And I think that's where it gets a little complicated, actually, in some ways, because that's the dominant narrative that we all live in, and it makes it very hard for anyone to take care of themselves. And I think, like I mentioned before, as highly sensitive people, we're very good at people pleasing as well, and we can drop into that role very easily, and it can become quite destructive. And so it can be hard to stand up for what you need as well. And so to be able to do that, like I applaud you for being able to do that because it's actually huge. And I think that's one thing that would be like super helpful for people to hear is that when you then honor your sensitivity by saying, well, no, I need this in order to function the way that I want to function, I think it gets easier then to be like, okay, here's what I need. Whereas if you're just sort of seeing your sensitivity as this thing that makes you a real inconvenience to people and annoying and frustrating, then you're not going to stand up and ask for what you want because you're going to be too worried about upsetting somebody else. And so I think that's a beautiful kind of illustration of like, yeah, when you honor your sensitivity and when you when you kind of claim it as part of, like, a really integral part of who you are and how you function in the world, it can be a really beautiful thing, because then you get to thrive. And like you said, you get to almost champion that process for other people too, which is,
Yeah.
I think, a really cool thing to be able to do.
We can soften the world a little bit and like just bring a little bit
Yeah.
more of this like sensitive influence into the world for others. You know, the
Yeah.
other thing I was thinking when you asked the question of like how has it been helpful to understand this HSP thing, there's certain scenarios like I found where I can get like kind of worked up or like agitated, like being in crowds. And for the longest time when this would happen, sometimes I would get kind of upset with myself, like, why are you being so reactive? Like, you've been doing yoga and meditation for like decades and you still like get so reactive in the grocery store and like get upset when people stand too close to you or bump their cart next to you and like feel like I'm going to snap and be like really rude at this person.
Yeah.
And then you know, once I started to think about it more through this lens of HSP, it's like, yeah, I have all those practices and I have those values, but I understand now that my nervous system, this is a place where it can so easily get overwhelmed and it can happen really quickly because I'm more sensitive. So it's not really my fault or a lack of mindfulness or self-control or whatever. It's
Yeah.
there's just like a lot less self-blame in it, and I can
Yes.
also go into a situation and anticipate how to maybe take a little more care of myself to avoid having that overwhelm hit in a busy, crowded place, for example.
Yeah, that's such a good example. It makes me think of, like, one for me is parenting. I've got 2 kids and they're only 2 years apart, and so when they were really little, I was constantly overstimulated, constantly, because the noise coming from 2 separate humans
Wow.
in 2 separate areas was just too much. And even though I knew I was highly sensitive at the time, I didn't honor it at all. And I, you know, if I could turn back time and do it again, I think I would do it very differently. But that's one thing I'm very aware of now. My kids are a bit older now. But even still, I will ask them, no, I can't listen to both of you at the same time. I can't actually deal with the amount of competing noise. So somebody needs to put earphones on, if they're playing video games or something, because I know that I can't just tune out all of those levels of noise around me. It doesn't work. And so, like,
Hmm.
where I'm sitting right now, I have like a little podcast corner. It's got some sound proofing and things. And sometimes my kids will want to do things in just sort of the next space over. And so I know for me, well, then somebody's going to need to somehow modulate their volume so that I'm not affected by this. And so I think you're right. It's like you can control the parts you can control, because you can't control the fact that your nervous system is going to have a little moment of being like, this is too many things. And the other thing that makes me think of is, like, if you know you're going to go into an environment where it will be perhaps challenging, being able to almost like prime yourself prior to that with
Hmm.
the practices that help you to downregulate and feel a bit more, in control, um, rather than leaving that to chance.
Exactly. Letting it catch you off guard, which, you know,
Mhm.
inevitably
It'll
sometimes it
happen.
will. That'll happen.
Yeah.
But if you know, like when I go to this particular market, things get intense.
Yes.
Or, you know, or whatever it is, you can, yeah, you can maybe decrease the stimulation in some way or prepare yourself by doing a practice to be a little more grounded beforehand.
Mhm.
Not necessarily a long practice. Maybe it's 30 seconds of feeling your feet before you go in there, but something.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I don't know if I'll articulate this well, but I think it depends a little bit too on what the thing you're doing means to you. Because
Yeah.
one of the other pieces of overstimulation for a HSP is your thoughts, right? Because what you're thinking can very easily lead anybody, highly sensitive or not, into being overstimulated. And, like, I know an example I sometimes use is, like, I love going to watch professional basketball, and that is very loud. That is
Oh, yeah.
very much not a HSP friendly space.
There's
It's
like an air
loud.
horn and
Yeah.
like
People
Loud
are loud.
music,
They've got the
cheering.
clicker-clacker thingies that you swing with your hands. There's lots of lights. There's, the games we go watch, there's like fire, there's flashing, and there's all sorts of things going on. I love it. Like, I love it. It's one of my favorite things to do. And yet it also seems like such a contradiction to my sensitivity. But when I'm there, I'm in a space of joy. And so for me, it's like almost that stuff just doesn't matter. It's like I probably will have some kind of like hangover from it later, but it's fine. I feel good about it. But if I was in a a really busy city and I was trying to get somewhere and crowds were just pressing in on me and there were people shouting, that would absolutely send me spiraling for sure, because my thoughts about it would be very different and my choice about it would have been very different. And so I think it's interesting to think about how like the layers of something can often impact how that feels as a HSP as well. It's like, it's not so simple as, is it loud and is it bright? It's like, what else goes along with that, and what does it mean to you, and have you chosen it, and do you feel like you have a sense of agency in that space? All of those things I think add up as well.
I really love that point because when we're talking about this, it could be easy to interpret it as like we're naming our limitations, and
Yes.
that now we know what to avoid, right? And we're going to just like kind of make our lives really small and live in this little bubble, which is not what I want. You're shaking your head like, not what I want either. So sometimes there's the challenge of how we can make the choice to do something that's, pings on our sensitivity, but we're choosing to do it and learning to cope with the discomfort and perhaps expand our capacity around that, so, because it's something we value.
Yes, I love that, the way that you worded that. I can think of a few examples where I've had to do that, which might be helpful for people
Yeah,
listening.
I love that.
One that comes to mind, because we were just up at the snow. So my family snow skis, and I learned to ski as like an 18-year-old, I think, when I met my now husband, or when we started dating. And learning to downhill ski as a highly sensitive person who isn't really an adrenaline seeker was very scary, because there was a lot of sensory information going on to do that. And I couldn't even count the number of times that I just stood at the top of the mountain and cried, because I was so overwhelmed, so overstimulated, so out of my depth. And now I ski really well, and I really like downhill skiing. I really like it. And it's something that I seek out. But it wasn't the same trajectory, I guess, as it might have been for someone who wasn't highly sensitive. And so we have to have, I think that's the thing, is it's like, and I can think of other examples, like for me, traveling solo is really scary. I find that very overwhelming on a sensory level. And so I've done that a few times, not many times, but a few. And it's important to me that I can do those things. And so for me, it's more knowing, okay, part of the reason this feels challenging is because my sensitivity means that I am going to get more easily overwhelmed. And so then I have to have my tools to say, okay, how am I going to tell my nervous system that I'm actually safe, that I'm actually okay, that even though this level of information is coming in and it feels like a lot, that I can, focus my attention, that I can breathe, that I can remind myself of all the things that I know to be true. And so you're right, it's not about making a smaller life or limiting ourselves or saying, well, I just don't do anything that sort of stimulates or overstimulates my system. I mean, you can do that. I don't want to do that though, because I want to live a life that, includes all of these things. And so I think that's a good point, is like you can desensitize a little bit. And it doesn't mean that you've actually desensitized yourself in the sense that you're no longer highly sensitive, but you're not derailed. I think that's the important thing. It's like, because sometimes your sensitivity, it can feel like it literally derails you. Like you can feel like a puppet on strings if you don't have tools to manage how your body reacts. And so that desensitization process, it's like teaching your body, no, it's okay. We're okay. We're not actually, dying or going to be completely consumed by this. I wonder if you have any examples of places where you've had to do that.
Yeah, like on that last point of just being able to sit with the discomfort of it and um, like realize it's okay. This sensation might be a little unpleasant, but I can handle this. This is going to sound like a funny example because it's not going to sound super stimulating, but there's this local yarn and craft store here that's really sweet. I really love it. And I've learned to crochet in the last year. And they have Sunday craft afternoon where you can come and sit around the table and there's people knitting or crocheting or doing other crafts. And they're just hanging out, like chit-chatting, and it's really sweet. And I'm actually going to a crochet class there tomorrow morning. So this is very timely. But I have noticed, like, I'm fairly new in town here, and I think I got way out of practice during the pandemic, like not being around groups of people so much, which I don't know. That's a whole other topic for HSPs, like what lockdown was like. But but so the last time I went, I was really aware of, like, I was sitting there unpacking my yarn and getting my crochet hook out, and just, I don't know that many people. They're all really friendly and sweet and just casual, and like sitting down, and I was just like very aware of, like, did anyone say hello? Did I say hello? Should I introduce myself? Like all this stuff. And I just took a moment and like looked around, used my eyes to orient to the space. Like, it's safe here. Take a breath, and I could feel my body, and it was like, okay, let me just encourage a little bit of settling here. And then I got my supplies out and started working on my little project, and then let myself just kind of listen a little bit to what people were saying, and then just sort of got involved organically into the conversation after a while. But I had to like give myself a moment to regulate and be in the space, even though that is a pretty chill space. But it's still like, they're strangers. Like, I don't know them. I am newer to crafting, and some of these people are like know way more about yarn than I do, and there is a lot to know about yarn. But it's like, it could be a little intimidating, and for my system, which is sensitive. So I did really like practice some awareness of that, and like just letting myself have a little time to integrate and just to like tolerate being there and then enjoy being there.
I don't think that it's funny. You're like, that won't sound like a highly stimulating environment. That does 100%
Really?
sound like yes, because I know that for me, when I have, how do I want to say this? I think that social environments for me are probably more stimulating than almost anything else. Like, I know that for me, as soon as you include people and people that I don't know, or people that I'm not sure what they think of me or what they know of me or what I know of them and what we're going to talk about, like all of that, that is very highly stimulating for me. So I get that.
Yeah.
And I sometimes would prefer to just be in a space where all I have to think about is myself or with familiar environments than I do with people who I can't predict. I think the social stuff is probably under talked about as HSPs. I know that sometimes that'll be the thing that I'll say things I didn't mean to say. I'll behave in ways I didn't mean to behave, because it becomes this. It sometimes for me it will feel like I've lost that intentionality, almost like what you were talking about. Like, I've intentionally grounded myself here. I've intentionally located myself in space. That will be the time that I will lose that, would be in an environment like that, even if it's calm. So I have to work on that often, of like, you don't have to fill the silence. You don't have to, make anybody else comfortable necessarily. That's not always your job, because I think that's part of it, is that it's, as a highly sensitive person, you're so aware of other people's facial expressions and body language and mood. Sometimes, there's a subset of HSPs that get termed empaths as well. And I would put myself in that category, and I would probably guess that you would too. And to be aware of all of those things, sometimes you can lose sight of what's yours and what's theirs,
Totally.
and what you're in charge of and what you're not, what you're responsible for and what you're not. So I think that's it's actually a much more complex example than it seems on the surface.
It's
Yeah.
like a quiet place, and it's not like bright flashing lights. Yeah, but that, yeah, it makes sense the way you kind of unpacked that for me. And
It makes me think of
yeah.
like, I think this happened to me more as a kid and as a teenager, but it still happens a little bit now. Like, have you ever been in a restaurant or something and another couple will be having an argument?
Oh my gosh.
It's the worst.
I can't I
I
can't,
can't deal.
like, my husband will be really quiet, and I'll be like, "Did you hear what they just said?"
Yeah.
Like, I'm
Mhm.
hearing the entire conversations at other tables, and he's totally
Mhm.
unaware of it. I always hear everything people are saying.
Or like if a siren goes by, that used to derail me. If I heard a siren, I would be just done. I couldn't focus anymore because I'm like, something bad has happened. Like, and so I
Hmm.
sometimes have a hard
Oh,
time.
that's like the noise and the empathy.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And so sometimes it's like, as a child, I remember this so vividly. If we were in the car and an ambulance went past, I was just like completely outside of myself. I couldn't
Oh.
regulate. I was so worried. That's less so now. I've definitely desensitized from that now because, ambulances and police cars and fire trucks are a dime a dozen. But in terms of, you'll see them most days. And that's where I think it can be tricky too. Like, I know I am an anxious HSP as well. And so I've dealt with a lot of anxiety over my life. And so it can be hard to differentiate those things sometimes.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that, yeah, that empathy piece can be really tricky, particularly as a younger person, if you haven't yet learned
Mhm.
what's yours and what's theirs. Yeah.
Yeah. It can go to some codependent places, and
Oh, yeah.
oh, yeah. What you're saying about the ambulance is interesting. Like, I teach a class every week now at a hospital locally,
Ah.
and I have this little practice that as I'm driving up in parking and as I'm leaving, and as I'm walking like through the halls to the rooms, internally I'm doing loving kindness phrases like,
Mm.
may everyone here be safe. May everyone here be healthy. May everyone have what they need. May all medicines be effective. Like that. And that's my way of meeting like the sensitivity of like, this is a place where people are struggling, and sometimes there's like a heavy cloud over a place like that, and you can sort
Yeah.
of sense that energy as a empath sensitive person, but you can work with it, right? Like that's my
Yes.
way of like not trying to push it away, but not being overwhelmed by it, because I can actually go, okay, what do I want to add to this field? Like I can send my good wish into it, and it helps me to kind of stay on track with the purpose. I'm here to teach this yoga therapy class and to offer something, beneficial in this place.
Yeah. I love that example. I wish I'd known that when I was younger. I think I avoided a lot of really potentially important experiences and
Mm.
opportunities because I wouldn't put myself in those sorts of situations, because I really didn't know how to regulate. I've been a very slow learner in that regard. Um, I think that's an important thing to point out too. Like I'm 41 and I've known that I've been highly sensitive for a very long time. And I'm a yoga teacher and I'm a counselor, and I'm still trying to figure these things out. And I absolutely feel imperfect in that. And I think that's
Hmm.
really the only way it can happen. I remember when I was at university, my first I was studying. I didn't finish this degree, but I was studying criminal justice
Oh my
because
goodness.
I wanted to be a forensic psychologist, which is a
Interesting.
very strange choice for a highly sensitive person, in the sense that it's very confronting, right?
But that whole thing of like needing to understand and like
Exactly,
the why,
exactly.
like, yeah,
I
that
was
makes sense.
obsessed with that when I was younger. Like, I used to do all this reading about criminals and things, and now you probably couldn't pay me to do that. I'd be like, "Don't wanna do that." But I remember we went on a field trip to a high security prison,
Whoa.
and immediately I was like, never going to do that for my job. That's terrible. But it was only because how my body felt in that space.
Yeah.
I was still fascinated. Like my mind was still like, I really would like to understand this stuff. But my physical body, the way it responded to being in that space was intolerable. And I do wonder if I'd had tools like I have now then, if I could have found a way to tolerate it that felt safe. But at the time it was like, absolute no. And so I think that's an interesting thing, right? Like when we honor our sensitivity, it can look like either staying away from certain spaces and things that don't feel like they honor our sensitivity, or like with you going into the hospital, finding ways to add to that experience or kind of like modulate that experience in some way that honors your sensitivity but allows you to still do the thing that matters to you and that feels important. Like I think that's a really
Yeah.
interesting distinction.
Absolutely. It doesn't always have to be about avoiding.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
unless you know how to handle those feelings of overstimulation, I think that will be the default. I know it was for
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. And even when you do have the tools and when you do have practices that support you, it also doesn't mean you need to push yourself into discomfort all the time. And again, you mentioned the people pleasing and the trying to fit in with like how the world seems to operate. Like
Yeah.
so this is like an interesting discernment point all the time for people with this trait, because it's like, am I up for this? Is this a time when I do choose to step into the discomfort, or is this a better time for me to just, back away from that and not experience that particular form of stimulation at this time?
That's an interesting segue into talking about like how we've designed our lives. I think
Yeah.
that makes me go, oh yeah, what have you done then? Because there's, I think from the outside looking in, I have absolutely designed my life to opt out of a lot of things on purpose. So I'd be curious to talk about that if you're up for it, just in terms of, like how have you built your life, designed your life, created a space for yourself in your work and in how you live that feels like it honors your sensitivity and maybe even like caters to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Mm,
Which in some way, some of those things were not conscious, but I can see it like
yeah.
when I think about it from this perspective, that it is connected to the HSP traits. Because I majored in music performance in school, and I really enjoyed being alone in my practice room playing my flute and finessing and refining and being really technical and like working on mastery and the subtleties of that. What I did not enjoy was performing. So that's kind of a problem in the performing arts, right?
Little bit.
So so shifted out of that, and I went from that into arts administration and fundraising and grant writing um, for arts organizations. My first job was for the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, which is an amazing ensemble. But my office was in a high rise in downtown Los Angeles, which I was like 28 or 29. And that was kind of exciting for a while. But being in that, like the heart of a busy city, wasn't going to be totally sustainable for me. And working in a busy office in a cubicle with like phones ringing and just a lot going on was really hard. And my role, especially the beginning of that career, was like grant writing. And so I'm trying to write, compose narratives and write. And there's just like other conversations. Like I said, I can't tune out other conversations.
Yeah.
And I can't listen to music with words if I'm writing, because it's
No.
like just not possible for me. And it was so hard to like focus and do the actual work that I was quite good at, but just in that environment, like with there was like the conference room was like, it was such an open design. Like there was like a thin cubicle wall separating my desk from the conference room. So there could be like a board meeting 2 feet away from me and 3 or 4 other people answering phones, selling tickets or whatever nearby. And it was just like a lot for me. Even putting in headphones, I could only listen to like the Brandenburg concertos or something that was like steady tempo, no lyrics, over and over again, just to try to get my work done. So yeah, so I have definitely over time shifted myself into a career where I mostly work at home. It does not involve the telephone very often because I absolutely can't stand talking on the phone unless I have to. It's, I have control over my own schedule. I have control over how much I take on and what time pressures there are. Like many, many examples, but like just it's had to take some of those skills that I had and put them in an environment where I can actually use them without a ton of distraction and, other stimulation going on. So
Yeah.
that's just, yeah, a lot of it I think has come up in my work life. How about you?
Yeah, same. Similar story, although I didn't ever learn to play any musical instrument. But I started my like working life also in a big city. So I was working in Melbourne and working in big offices. I worked for a small organization at first, but then I started working for government and not for profit. And I could not figure out why I always felt awful, like always felt awful. And part of it for me was the reality of having to like get on a busy train in each direction. And like you, I found it that exciting for a while. Like I felt kind of important and I
You're like
kind of
young and up
felt,
for it. It's
yeah.
like,
And
yeah,
I felt grown up and, I felt so
totally.
responsible and all those things. And I thought I wanted that life. I thought I wanted a busy corporate life. I don't even really know where that thought came from, but what happened was I just was constantly unwell. And probably more from an anxiety point of view than colds and flus. I just constantly felt like a shell of myself.
Mm.
And I just remember being particularly impacted by other people's behavior. Like it was like there was a lot of politics in the organizations that I
Mm-hmm.
worked for. There was workplace bullying. There was a lot of stuff going on, and
Mm.
I couldn't tune it out. I couldn't just sort of be like, that's not my stuff, set it to the side and move on. And so that's something that we haven't really talked about, but to just touch on it briefly, the something that's really important for HSPs as a general rule is like meaning in their work.
Yeah.
We tend to really struggle if we don't have a sense of meaning and purpose in what we're doing. And I just didn't have that. I couldn't justify the amount that I was being paid for the kind of work that I was doing because I didn't feel like it was making an impact. And it was stuff that people would say to me like, don't worry about it. They're paying you. Just like get over it. And I was like, but it really matters to me, which, can sound a little high and mighty and a little pious, but
I mean, no,
it,
it's like that's your life. You're spending the majority of your waking hours doing that. Your time is your life. And so I'm
yeah.
totally with you on that.
I think it felt completely misaligned. And I didn't know that that was really the case. So I left the corporate workforce after probably about 5 years of doing that and then became a yoga teacher and never worked full time again. And, I guess I was probably like late 20s at that point, and now I'm early 40s and I've like never worked a proper job since then, proper. And so same as you, I've created a life where I work from my home, doing work that I'm very passionate about, doing work that, I certainly don't. I haven't stuck with it this long because it's paying me, millions of dollars. That's for sure. So the sense of purpose has been really important to me,
Yeah.
and I struggle with that sometimes. I'm not going to lie. There are days where I think, "Gosh, if only you could just deal with having a normal job." So
Yeah.
I've made that mean a lot of things over my life. I think it's only been in recent time where I've really been able to see that as a gift that I've given myself as a HSP, to be able to say like, actually, that was a really kind and compassionate choice that I've made towards myself. I think for a long time I saw it as I didn't have a choice because I was too like soft for anything else, which
Hmm.
wasn't very generous. That felt
Yeah.
very cruel in a lot of ways to think
Yeah.
about it through that lens. And I think on a really practical level, like even just the way that I've set up where I work. I don't work in the kitchen for instance. I work because I've got a family of 2 kids, and they're often obviously at school when I'm working, but like I work in a very, like I'm in a corner of a room, and behind me I've got my yoga space, which I'm very lucky to have, so much space available to me. But I very much designed it so that like I'm not sensorially, is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
Constantly distracted, because if I had lots of other things to look at, I would have a very hard time focusing, I think. So yeah, little things like that. It's like, yeah, the work that I do, but then also the way that I have set myself up in my space very much tailors to my high sensitivity.
Yeah, I totally relate to all of that, and especially the theme of like the work needs to mean something. And yeah, that one is huge for me. And I didn't major in music because I was looking to make a bunch of money being
Yeah.
a classical musician either. So I have this tendency to not choose the most like practical things according to our society. And I, like you, sometimes I do get like critical of myself, like, damn, why couldn't you just do that normal thing? And the I wouldn't say it's easy because I see everybody seems to struggle with
Yeah.
livelihood. To be honest, there's so many trade-offs to all of those choices, but the like secure thing, right?
Exactly. I was going to say there's something about it though that does sometimes feel easier, but maybe it is that security. It's like the certainty
Yeah.
of you show up, you do your work, you get paid, you go home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I still wouldn't switch it though.
Yeah. No, I'm not ready to give up this meaningful, challenging HSP life either.
No, no. And
Yeah.
I hope that all the HSPs listening, nobody needs a permission slip to do that, but like if you feel like you do, take this as it because I think it can be tricky to go against the dominant cultural narrative too,
Hmm.
and like the last thing that HSPs want to be seen as is selfish and
Yeah.
somehow above other people or
Indulgent and
indulgent. Exactly. It's like, so it takes something, I think, as a HSP to claim it and be like, well, this is simply what works better for me. Some people literally thrive in environments that we don't. And so
yeah.
it's like, we can't all be the same. Um, Working a 40 or a 50-hour week would destroy me. I just know it, even doing work that I adore.
Hmm.
Um, so it's like, yeah, how do you, although to be honest, I do work a lot of hours, but it's like the freedom to take breaks, the freedom to notice, oh, my HSP body is just like needing something else right now. I think we can do that in lots of ways, and it doesn't always require us to work for ourselves or opt out of a paycheck. So, there's ways to do that, I think, in other ways as well.
But it takes some thought. It definitely
Yeah.
takes some doing and some looking around, and I think some inner work of like just not going to that default of judging yourself by the standards of whatever you've absorbed from society, whatever that vision of success might be, which if you're like me, you somehow have like that internalized like metrics of success, but you really don't even believe in them. And yet you can judge
Yeah.
yourself by them, and yet you don't even believe in them. And it's like,
Totally.
what is this?
Mhm. And I think that's a little bit of a HSP thing too, to be so aware of that,
Yeah.
because it's like, I think you know, sometimes that whole overthinking thing, like where people are
Yeah.
like, I think you're overthinking this. You're like, no, this is the only level of thinking I
This is the
have.
amount of thinking that is available.
Exactly. It's like you can't help but make those links and those connections. And so I think being able to give yourself grace in that process of being like, well, this is just how my brain processes things. And then I'm going to need to give myself time and space to figure out what I want from that, rather than defaulting to the self-judgment and criticism. And,
Hmm.
I think that's been my biggest lesson as a HSP, is being able to be self-compassionate, and self-kind, because it's not always easy. I always sort of like to say that, being highly sensitive is a gift, and it's a superpower if we embrace it. but it's also very hard sometimes and
Mm-hmm.
can feel very challenging to navigate. And so having the ability to be compassionate and kind towards yourself, I think is like, for me, it's the most important thing.
It's hugely important.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite practices for tending to your sensitivity? Tending to it kind of in advance, and also like the calling emergency,
Yes.
maintenance practices for high stimulation moments. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, the obvious as a mindful movement teacher is definitely regular movement for me is huge. I think I feel a lot of my overwhelm and my high sensitivity in my physical body.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like I walk every day. I do some kind of movement every day. I don't have a super formal mindful movement practice. I tend to do it in small bits throughout the day. I'll just lie on the floor and do my thing rather than have a full sort of stretch of an hour, but I'll do it regularly. I need to sit in quiet. Some people call that meditation. I don't always. I need to just close my eyes at, hopefully more than once a day, but sometimes it's only once. They're probably my main sort of like maintenance things. And like you said, eating regularly. Um, and and I guess I did actually write a few things down because I was like, I actually do a lot. And I guess my like call emergency is generally breathing practices, grounding practices, and internal resource practices. So I have like, and I find that most people do, and this is something I often do with clients, is like finding an inner space of resourcing within your own body that often is the place where it feels spacious or calm, even in the midst of dysregulation. And so I often will use that in my sort of emergency periods of just like, hang on, I know that place exists. Where is it? And compassionate self-touch, so hands on
Mm-hmm.
my body, and compassionate self-talk. They're probably, emergency 101 for me. Talking to myself like I would a child often. We often say like, how would you speak to your best friend? I often think of it as like, how would I speak to myself as a child? Yeah, they're probably my main ones. Yeah. What about you?
Those are great. Yeah, I think I do share quite a few of those. And yeah, it's eating at regular intervals. Getting enough sleep is huge for me. I do not do
Mm,
well when I'm tired. Um, and I generally need a fairly slow start in the morning. I'm not a great morning person, and I'm not the kind of person who can roll out of bed and like 10 minutes later be out the door or doing
yeah.
stuff, right? I need like the first cup of coffee and like kind of sitting on the couch and going, okay, how am I doing? What's today? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is this? So I need some space to sort of boot up in the morning slowly. And I notice like I do get like challenged by it. Like my husband is more of a morning person. He wakes up before I do, and like on the weekends a lot of times he wakes up with what we call chore energy, and that's like when he wants to get all the shopping and laundry and everything done so then he can relax.
Mm-hmm.
And we've learned like we have to compromise on this because like you can start your chores, I'm going to help later, like, but I can't like give
Yeah.
up that spacious time that I need in order to like not feel guilty about the fact that he's doing some cleaning the bathroom or something. Which how awesome that my husband is good with doing chores. I'm not trying to discourage that. It's just sometimes the timing, right? Like I know I need that space. But
Mm,
those are sort of, I guess, like the structural life pieces that I notice and basics. But yeah, I need movement practice pretty much every day. Sometimes that's going outside into nature for a walk, getting some vitamin tree, as I call it. Like I really feel nourished by a natural environment, which is why
yeah.
I love where I live. Um, Also, yeah, mindful movement practices like qigong has become very important to me in the last like 4 or 5 years because it has such a variety of different movements within it. It has some really good like nervous system discharge practices and energy clearing, as to use the language, right, of qigong, but it's like nervous system discharge. And it also has really soft, like flowing movements that are just like meditation and motion. So it has a lot of range that works for me there. But yeah, all of the forms of movement that I've done, yoga, somatic movement, have all been important at different times and in different ways. And my meditation practice, yeah, is where, you know, I really go to reflect on how am I doing? What the heck is any of this anyway? You know, life, the universe, and everything. And
just the small questions.
it's just, yeah, it's so important to me. It's not really possible to ignore those big questions. You know, those existential pieces are just part of the how my mind works on a daily basis, which
totally
I see is not for everyone. But
yeah, that makes me think I want to add one more thing to my list, which I said I go for a walk most days, and my walk is actually very early in the morning with a friend, and we talk the whole way. And that depth of conversation on such a regular, like it's a regularly, is so important to my maintenance. And I speak regularly with my husband as well. Like we'll take breaks. He works from home as well. We'll take breaks. I realize I need to verbalize things often to feel more regulated. So for me, a huge part is like talking to, and I see my therapist probably every second week as well. So for me, verbal, just like, I think I figure things out through my words. And so for me, I actually didn't even really think about that before. That's a huge part of my maintenance. If I don't do that, I think I will, you know, I would put that almost up there as important as movement for me. They're probably like the two pillars. It's like I need quiet, I need movement, and I need space to talk and explore.
Expression.
Yeah, expression. That's a good way to say
Right.
it. But I think you're right. It's like the important things, the important questions. It's like I don't want to just talk about what I had for lunch yesterday. I want to try to understand how I work, how you work, how we relate, what it all means, you know. So it yeah, it's a funny thing, but makes a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that one. I might not have thought of that either, but I see that as well. Like I do need to I update my husband a lot on how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
You know, and like big stuff and little stuff, but all day we're checking in. Like there's something about that, just kind of like acknowledging how you're feeling and naming it and being seen in it. And I think that expression is important.
And I think what you just said then, being seen, I think highly sensitive people cannot underestimate how, like, even if you're introverted, we crave to be seen on a much deeper level. And so I think we have to go out and seek that out, you know, like, yeah, that's probably a whole other conversation. But I think that's an important point to make, is that like there is that need to be seen and understood, because it can feel lonely, I think, when you're kind of in this, you know, one of the questions on Elaine Aron's HSP self-test is like, do you have a rich inner world?
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, I do. And if that rich inner world isn't being nourished, then we can feel quite incomplete. And I think that's where it can feel lonely, is if your rich inner world stays solely inner and you don't ever have the chance to express it or feel understood in it. It can feel, I think, a little bit lonely. I think I spent a lot of time there in my younger years.
Yeah. So as you were saying that, I was thinking, like, I appreciate it when people kind of draw those questions out of me, or when people actually ask.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but like it helps me to know like how receptive they are to hearing about my rich inner world, because
yes,
like sometimes it feels like it can be that awkward thing where, especially if you don't know someone well, like how much information do they want me to share at this moment? Is this a casual, yes, I'm fine, thank you for asking, or is this a like,
I'll tell you the truth.
Let me tell you. You know?
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point, Addie, because as HSPs, I think many HSPs have the experience of being the go-to person for a lot of friends and family,
The good listener.
the good listener. And so I know that at various points in my life, I have felt neglected because people haven't asked me about me.
Mm-hmm.
And as a HSP, I also don't even like to admit that, because it's like, oh, I care so much about, and I do care so much about other people, but it's that whole thing of like, I want you to be interested in me.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, if that's not fed, that can feel uncomfortable, because then we can sort of shut off a little bit, and then it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. But it's like, yeah, we want people to be genuinely interested in the richness of what's going on in our minds, and not everybody's willing to go there, so it can be a bit of an interesting negotiation, I think, at times.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a particular, like, it's happened to me a few times where a friendship got kind of imbalanced in that way.
Yeah.
And like thinking of one in particular where it got like this person, this friend was like going through a really rough time, and our time together became a lot of me listening to their stories and what was going on, and they would unload for a while, and then there was a lot of drama, and then they'd be like, well, how are you? And I'd be like, I'm fine. Because like we were kind of out of time and I didn't have drama, and I was like, do you want to hear about the soup I made? Like it just
Yes.
just didn't match, and it got really like that built up over time, and it got really imbalanced. And at the time I didn't quite, it was gradual, and I really didn't see it until later, and I wouldn't have known, I don't think, how to like adjust for that.
It's hard to adjust for, I think. I think it can be really challenging to adjust for. I know that I've had to, at times in my life, just acknowledge that that's how I'm feeling, like after the fact, be like, I didn't feel seen in that interaction, even though I feel like I gave a lot of myself just by being present to that conversation. And I think because a lot of HSPs, we end up in kind of like the helping professions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like as a counselor, that's literally my job, to listen. And so I'm good at it. It's something that I want to do, and I want to do in all of my relationships. But then sometimes it can be hard to transition. I think for a lot of HSPs, can be hard to transition out of just being the helper, just being the support,
Yeah.
to being an equal, vulnerable participant in a friendship or a partnership or whatever. But I think naming it sometimes can be really helpful. Like, oh yeah, I didn't feel like I had the opportunity to be seen in that exchange. And it does feel a little imbalanced to me. And, maybe next time I need to lead off with like, there's something I want to share. It's not always easy, but I think it's like a bit of an experimental kind of thing to see like, well, what do I have to do to have my needs met? Because sometimes we will have to ask, which is
Yeah.
deeply uncomfortable sometimes.
Deeply.
I don't have needs. It's fine.
I'm just over here being very quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think it's sometimes that is like I need to challenge myself to offer a little bit more of myself in some way, and not worry as much about like how ready that person is to receive it that day. I mean, try to be considerate, but like like being these
Yeah.
empaths, we can get a little over concerned, I think, with that and like how others are feeling, and then kind of like prioritize what we think their need might be, even though we probably didn't ask, but we're
Yeah.
kind of projecting,
We just
and then
take too much
diminish our own.
responsibility. Yeah, we take
Yeah,
far too much responsibility. And I think that's the
exactly.
thing. Learning, like, if there's one skill that I wish I'd learned earlier as a HSP, it would be like handing back responsibility to every adult in the room to be in charge of their own emotions. I very much grew up as the peacekeeper. In
Mm-hmm.
all of my relationships, I was the one that just kind of knew which button to flick, which thing to turn to get everybody back to level, or to feel like the space was more peaceful. But it was never my responsibility, and it
Yeah.
never is. And so I think if I could have learned that as a younger person, to be like, I'm not responsible for how you feel. It's hard to believe that, though, I think sometimes as a HSP, because you have tangible evidence of
Mm-hmm.
I can change how you feel by the way I behave. So it's not an easy one to play with, but
And it can be so easy for people to rely on us and our ability to do
totally.
that, and not on purpose, but they sometimes play into those patterns and they're not so helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard because, I don't know about you, but for me, I know that being that person has been something that I'm very proud of, to be
Yeah.
able to be that person that people feel comfortable to talk to, that they say, oh, I feel so much better after we've chatted. Like I wear that as a bit of a badge of honor sometimes. Like I want to be that person for people. I love that I have
Hmm.
that capacity. But if it's to your detriment all the
Yeah.
time, then you have to be super sort of careful about how that plays out, and not prioritizing that feeling over your actual needs as a human. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting space.
I think it's just about a balance, with that
Totally.
one. Yeah.
Mm.
I was thinking about, because we are both movement, mindful practitioners, that, especially like doing these very quiet, soft, gentle types of movement practices, they have a way of actually increasing our sensitivity, right? And
Yeah.
I was wondering, what you think about this. Like, is it always a good thing to be doing practices that might heighten our awareness or increase our sensitivity? Part of the reason I bring it up is I have also seen like some more skeptical minded folks who've raised like studies where they said, high interoception might be linked to anxiety, right? Or things
Hmm.
like that. So I'm just curious what your thought. I have some thoughts about it, but I'm curious like what you if that
Mm.
brings up, a certain response for you.
Yeah. I I would like to read some of those studies about the high interoception potentially increasing anxiety. I don't. I believe that could definitely be true. Um, I think that when you are highly aware of your interoceptive signals, that which which not every HSP is, because they're much more aware of their thoughts.
Mm.
So what I see a lot is people who say, I'm not very connected to my body
Mm.
because I'm very, very connected with my overthinking. That
Hmm.
tends to be my experience with clients. But then when you take them through some sort of somatic practice, some body awareness practice, they're very aware of their interoceptive signals
They take to it well.
very well, but they just haven't always paid that much attention. In my opinion, I think that it definitely increases our capacity to notice the impact of our sensitivity. I don't know that it increases our actual sensitivity. I think it just hones our like inner eye to what the impact of that sensitivity is. So in my opinion, it then becomes easier to both regulate because you're aware of the fact that there's certain dials that you can turn to help yourself along, but it also can make you better at recognizing when you're becoming overstimulated,
Hmm.
or and I think it can also help you do that, some of that desensitizing, right? Because you're like, well, this is just a normal feeling that I have that's associated with being in this environment or being, whatever. Um, but I think that the important modulator of that is the ability to be self-compassionate and to
Hmm.
be self-kind and to be able to get enough distance that you don't just jump straight into catastrophe and catastrophizing when you notice these things. So I can see why that link would be made, but I think if we're simultaneously developing our ability to be self-compassionate and curious and respond through that lens of honoring our sensitivity, I think that we're okay. But I don't know. Does that make sense? And what do you think? What's
Yes,
your
that
thoughts?
absolutely makes sense. And it's honestly been a while since I looked at any of that research, but I see it come up. I've seen people bring it up every once in a while. And like my take on it is like it's one thing to be sensitive and to be perceiving sensations And that's not exactly the same thing as what we do in practice, which develops mindfulness around the sensations we're perceiving. So there's another step that we're training when we do a mindful movement practice, which is not only the perception of the sensation, but noticing how we react to it and how it might create a cascade of other sensations or feeling tones of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral or thoughts. And then we sort of start to see the pieces of that process and learn to develop more discernment around it and more agency around it. So as we get to know it, we get to know that sensitivity or that sensation itself or that feeling. Then we have more choice of, how we interpret it or what we do with it. We don't have to fall into the habit pattern with it. Right. So I think that that's the tool building, the skill building that the practices should hopefully be cultivating, which is, it's a little different than someone who's just kind of naturally sensitive and they can feel their heart beating and they can feel every little change in their body. And that, because that can easily lead to like a lot of health anxiety and feeling like, I'm not sure if this is okay or not. And it can be, quite mysterious and quite difficult to navigate, right? And that's,
I see
think
that in
for me,
kids. I see
yeah,
that in
totally.
sensitive kids. Yeah, highly sensitive kids, if they haven't yet learned how to differentiate or do something with those sensations, absolutely it inspires anxiety. Absolutely. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really important what you've just pointed out. It's like it's everything that goes along with that noticing because, just a simple sensory noticing. Yeah, if you can feel your heart rate increasing. There's that quote from Deb Dana. That's my favorite quote where she says, "The mind narrates what the nervous system knows." It's my
Oh,
favorite quote. The mind narrates what the nervous system knows. And so I think that's really important when we're talking about this topic because it's like, your nervous system is going to throw up symptoms or
signals,
sensations,
right?
signals, that's it, of increased heart rate, increased breathing, because it has perceived some level of threat somewhere to your security and safety. Your brain then has to make up some sort of story to
An interpretation
narrate
happens.
what's going on. And so if you're a child or an adult who hasn't been able to differentiate or create a narrative that feels supportive and gives you choice, like you said, then probably the inevitable default pattern is going to be to go into overwhelm, panic, anxiety, stress, because you don't have another choice. So, and your mind will always do that. Your mind will always come up with a narrative
Yeah.
because it has to. How else are you going to act appropriately if you don't know what you're acting for? So I think that's super important. Look at us just solving all the
All the
problems of the world.
questions,
It's
right?
it's but it's like it's so fascinating because it takes what's on the surface level, kind of a simple idea of this idea of interoception being just able to notice what's going on, but it's like, hang on, no, it's actually more complex than that. There's more
There's more
to it.
discernment. Yeah, there's more about getting to know it and questioning
Befriend
some
it.
of the interpretations. And I mean, I see it like I can totally see, this being an issue for a sensitive child, but it's a sensitive middle-aged person who is experiencing some changes and new
Yes.
sensations. It's like, it's sometimes hard to know when I'm being a hypochondriac and the other extreme of when am I just totally ignoring something that I need to get addressed.
Yep.
And like, where's the middle? Where's the middle on this? And yeah, as someone who has a lot of body awareness, sometimes I'm like, yeah, you're just feeling a lot of stuff. And
Yes. Yes. And it's hard because sometimes there will be things like I've just recently been diagnosed with like two fairly chronic conditions that
oh,
I didn't know I had, even though I probably like I was picking up on the symptoms, but I, was kind of dismissing them because I am so sensitive to my inner sensations.
mm-hmm,
Anyway, I obviously got them checked and I'm fine and I'm, doing what I need to do. But it is an interesting point. Like we have to also kind of quiet or placate that inner voice that says maybe you're being too much and go
Mm-hmm.
to the doctor and get things checked, because there is that fine line of like, am I just responding to every tiny little thing?
Yeah.
But also, what a gift to be able to pick up on the subtle
Yeah.
and to potentially go and get that looked at and dealt with and supported
Before it's more
before it's
serious.
a huge problem. So,
Yeah.
we can kind of look at it from both sides. I had a very small procedure done yesterday where I had to have a local anesthetic, and the surgeon could obviously tell that I was quite anxious. And I don't even really know why I was anxious. I just had a pretty hard day. And I think that had like compounded things for me. And I said to him, I'm really nervous this is going to hurt because I've never had a local anesthetic before. And later on, he says to me, I gave you about 3 times as much local as I normally would. And I was like,
Whoa.
okay. But I felt so strange. And I think it was because he'd kind of overloaded me. But it was like, I don't even know where I'm going with that story, but my point being that sometimes being sensitive can lead health professionals to deal with us slightly differently too, which is kind of
Yeah,
interesting,
that's true.
And so you do have to advocate for yourself. You do have to advocate for, no, I really do believe that there's something here that needs to be investigated further, or, please don't dose me up that high because I am quite sensitive. So it's, yeah, that's probably opening a whole can of worms. But your whole point of like, I've kind of lost my train of thought. But yeah, we do have to be our own advocates,
Yeah.
for sure.
And I think our practice plays a role in helping us to develop that language around our sensations and to get to know what we're feeling, to get to know how we're feeling about what we're feeling, and to be able
Yes.
to articulate that and have the tools, as you mentioned before when I asked this question, to self-regulate around that. So even
Yeah.
if there is something that needs to be dealt with, we can sometimes calm the fires of reactivity around that, or the fear around that, or the frustration around that, or whatever it might
Totally.
be, because there's so many layers of like, there's the sensation, and there's the reaction to the sensation, and then there's the thoughts about that, and the stories, and how it relates to my identity, and what it's going to mean in the future, and blah 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 blah.
When you say it like that, it's like, oh yes. I mean, that's literally the process.
Yeah.
And of course it's tiring. So of course we need more time alone. Of course we need more processing time. Of course we need more self-care, because that's a lot
Yeah.
for every little thing.
Yeah. And that's where the mindfulness and the self-compassion come in, because it's like the mindfulness makes us aware of like, oh, I'm doing that pattern again. I've got that tape loop playing.
Yes.
That's the thing. This is what happens when I feel this sensation. It's triggering this pattern. And then the
Yeah.
self-kindness, like, oh, sweetheart, it's okay. You're going to make it through this. You can deal with this intelligently and responsively and with care,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So that requires awareness, that requires practice.
Exactly what I was about to say, awareness and practice. And I think it's something that we will be practicing until our very last breath, because it's a forever thing to navigate. And that's what I always like to remind other HSPs too, is it's like there's nowhere to get to. There's nowhere where you exist, where you are perfectly regulated all the time and where your high sensitivity doesn't ever impact you. Like, of course it does. And of course you're going to be dysregulated, and of course you're going to be overstimulated. But I think your use of the word choice before is really key. It's like, what tools do you need to practice and to have in your kit so that you do feel like you have choice, rather than feeling like you are, this puppet on its strings. And I
Mm-hmm.
know for me, there's some areas where I do feel like I have a bit more of a handle on things. And then there are other areas where I'm like, wow, my sensitivity is really like kind of driving here in a way that doesn't feel honoring of my needs. And so, okay, what am I going to do to get curious about that and love that part of myself and work through that? So it can be a really interesting lens to do that sort of self-development, self-discovery, self-reflective kind of work.
Yeah. Wow. I am loving this conversation and noticing the time as
I know.
well. But I wanted to ask if there's anything else that you want to add to the mix here. before we
Um,
sign off?
I don't think so. I'm just quickly looking at the things that I'd written down, but um, no, I guess I would just like reiterate the point that I think, if I could teach every single HSP on the planet one thing, it would be self-compassion. Um, if you don't know how to do that, it's worth continuing to explore and practice, because I don't know that it comes supernaturally to the HSPs of the
Mm,
world, or anyone, to be honest. But I think it's a game changer, because when you are so prone, I guess, to overstimulation and the self-criticism that can come with that, because it does tend to sometimes lead you into behavior that just feels, like you said earlier, misaligned with your values, misaligned with who you see yourself to be.
mhm.
I think self-compassion is like a non-negotiable skill to develop, because it's the thing that applies in every scenario, I think, as a HSP. What about you? Anything that we didn't cover, or anything you want to reiterate?
I don't know. There are probably more things we could delve
Maybe we need to
into.
do another one.
We probably could. Yeah, I would love that. But yeah, I just want to echo what you said about self-compassion and some of the value of exploring a topic like this and understanding these kinds of traits that one may inhabit and embody is to just dial down some of that self blame or criticism of I don't fit in or I'm different or whatever it might be. And just to, that creates a space to embrace how you are exactly as you are. And that is really the essence of self compassion, right? Being on your own side, right?
Yeah.
Not at anyone else's expense, but just, being on your own team
Yeah.
and making sure that you're paying attention to your needs.
Hmm. I think it's almost like knowing that you have just that sure bet, right? Like that friend that you can always call or text if you don't want to pick up the phone.
That's
That
me.
will, yeah, same. That will meet you with the love and compassion that you crave, and knowing that you can actually get that from yourself as well. Like, I think that's the key. If you know the relationship that you have with yourself is the most intimate that you'll ever have with anyone, and you don't escape any of your thoughts. They're all being processed, and so to be able to cultivate an inner landscape that's like soft and welcoming and warm and loving, I think is beyond helpful. It's beyond any other tool that I've ever played with.
And honestly, that like when you're able to live from that place, that radiates out to the others around you and provides a more beneficial space for them as well without it having to be about giving up what you need. So it's
Yeah.
kind of beautiful,
Yes. And
beautiful thing.
I know we're trying to wrap up, but I want to say one more thing about that, which is just that it doesn't remove your humanity. It like embraces your humanity. So like
Yeah.
I very much have cultivated this inner kindness and this inner compassion, but there are still times, like not infrequently, where that inner critic is really loud, and there are times where even my husband has to say, like, stop beating up on yourself. Cultivating that inner landscape isn't a one and done. I've
Hmm.
done it, it's done, I'm always kind. And I think that's where people get tripped up. They're like, oh, but I was really, I was unkind to myself. And I'm like, no, it's because we're unkind to ourselves that we have to cultivate self-compassion. If we weren't unkind to ourselves, we wouldn't need it, because it would have literally
It'd be
no
a given.
purpose. Exactly. So it's not the absence of self-criticism or the absence of those thoughts that kind of is the gold standard. It's your ability to meet them with compassion. That's
Hmm.
the key. And I think that's just the last thought I want to share is like, know that you're not getting it wrong. It's because we're unkind, it's because we're critical, it's because we can have these harsh judgments that we need compassion. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not about not having those thoughts, but not identifying with those thoughts as the truth of who we are and not taking that voice to be me,
Yeah.
right? It's just thoughts. So we can bring in other thoughts that are more self-compassionate and change the balance in there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh my
Thank you,
gosh.
Addie.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation to have. I knew it was going to be rich and didn't know exactly what we would cover, but I think we've talked about a lot.
We have, and I feel like it's like ticked that box today of depth of conversation. We've done that.
Awesome.
Thank you for filling that, that
Yeah,
bucket
thank
for me
you.
today.
Me too. Yeah, it fills me up to talk about this with you.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again.
Thanks so much.
So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.